Very happy to be here today and to introduce our moderator and also to thank the people who put this together. Folks here at Venable, Jeremy Grant, Bree Law, and Ari Schwartz, they're hosting us and helped us organize this. And on the Internet Society's team, we had Dustin Phillips, Ethan Wam, and David Vjorst. I think most of you know the Internet Society. It's a unique group. It's been around for more than 25 years, helping write the standards for the Internet and influence Internet policy around the world. Our group here in DC is one of the more active chapters in the Internet Society, and we bring together technologists, business people, policymakers, advocates to have debates like this one about the most important issues facing the Internet today. This is an audience participation event. We do not have speakers today or panelists. We have discussion catalysts. And our moderator, Jeremy Grant, will introduce them. Their job is to say provocative things that get a discussion going. And your job is to keep the discussion going. Hopefully we have a little bit of difference of opinions so we can have some debate. And we know we're not going to find a solution to every aspect, but at least we'll frame the issue better than it's been framed before. So over to you, Jeremy.
Thanks. Well, good morning, everybody, and thanks for being here today. By the way, if you're wondering why there's microphones but no amplification, these microphones are only for the live stream. This event's being recorded, but I think we've got a small enough group that we can all project well and hear each other. Good morning. Welcome to Venable. I'm Jeremy Grant. I'm a managing director in the firm's cybersecurity and technology strategy practice. I'm thrilled we're able to host all of you here today for this forum. A deep passion for the openness of the Internet and an ability of any individual, no matter how out there their views, to communicate them online was what brought me to DC for the first time in 1995. I wanted to help make sure the country got the policy right in the early days of the Internet. And this passion is something that keeps me here today. Though I have to say, well, I never really thought about it until this past summer, thankfully. It's also safe to say that the lack of friendly views towards Nazis in our government, relatively at least these days, is also something that keeps me here today. My folks didn't fare so well the last time those people were in power. So against that backdrop, I've got to admit that this past summer, when Cloudflare, GoDaddy, Google, and others took actions to make it harder for the Daily Stormer from spreading its hate, lies, racism, incitement to violence, I was pretty happy to see it because as a general rule, anything that frustrates the ambitions of Nazis, hey, I have a pretty easy time getting behind that. But it was not lost on me at the time that amidst all the rejoicing about the demise of this website, something notable had happened. Private companies that controlled major parts of the Internet's infrastructure had used that power to make decisions about who was allowed to communicate their views through that infrastructure and how they could do it based on the views held by an organization. So in a time when this country is growing increasingly polarized, it's not hard to see how the precedent that was set here might at some point be used to justify action against a wider array of entities and views. The slope can be quite slippery. Nazis are terrible after all, but there are those who might argue that some other parties are almost as bad and thus be used to justify similar actions. And I think what was interesting was the companies themselves who were involved this summer actively realized this, with some openly fretting about the implications of their actions. Cloudflare, for example, where Michael and Doug come from, wrote, without a clear framework as to a guide for content regulation, a small number of companies will largely determine what can and cannot be done online. And if private companies are building more capabilities to restrict who can be heard online, does that then mean that repressive governments might require them to use those capabilities on their behalf to censor the global Internet? So these are some of the issues I hope to discuss today. So here to kick us off, as Michael mentioned, we don't have panelists, we have discussion catalysts to get us started. Doug Kramer, the General Counsel from Cloudflare, Mark MacCarthy, the Senior Vice President for Public Policy at SIIA, and Robert McDowell, former FCC Commissioner and a partner at Cooley. I'm not going to read their full bios. Instead, I'll ask each of them going down the line to introduce themselves as part of their introductory remarks. And once they've properly catalyzed this discussion, we'll then run hard through 11 o'clock with me as the moderator to the extent that a moderator is needed. I do want to note to everybody this is an open event. You know it's being filmed and live streamed. I think there was also at least one reporter who was registered. I'm not sure if they're here or not. But everybody should assume that remarks are on the record. So with that, let me first turn to Doug.
Great. So In my role as catalyst, I'll just sort of talk briefly about myself, and then a little bit of background, but then leave some of the views and other substantive comments for hopefully what will be a vibrant, ongoing conversation. So I'm Doug Kramer. I'm the general counsel at Cloudflare. I have been in that role. I'm responsible for our legal and policy and trust and safety work. For those of you who don't know, I will try to make this as painless as possible. Cloudflare operates a network that is meant to secure and optimize the transmission of information on the internet. We can sit between a website host where the data is stored and a user who wants to access that data. And the way it works is at about 120 forward-placed points of presence around the world. If a user wants to visit a website that uses Cloudflare, it goes to the closest point of presence to be screened to make sure it's not a DDoS attack, it's not a known phishing or malware attack, and that it should be answered. And then if it is answered, we figure out whether or not any of the information it is looking for might be cached at that forward point because of a recent request that came from the same area. As a result, we secure those hosts from cyber attack, and also we're able to optimize and make much more efficient the transmission of internet requests around the world, because instead of having to do the long haul all the way to the host, which may be halfway around the world, we can often serve several elements from right next door. We have about 7 million web properties or web domains that use Cloudflare right now, and as a result, we sit on about 10% of global internet queries, and that's the way that we approach that. I'll just briefly touch on, also as way of introduction, a bit of our approach to content and the issue that we ran into this August with the Daily Stormer. Because of the way our network works and what we do, we have often taken a open internet approach to questions about content that flows on our network. We are about optimizing and securing the internet. We don't host the data. We can't really do anything about taking the data down. We can just figure out whether or not it's transmitting through our network or not. That has faced challenges over the years, right? Because on the one, to maintain a no censorship approach is an abstract approach that misses some of the visceral reality of problematic anecdotes, and there are few more problematic anecdotes than Nazi speech. And as larger context than to just the August example, we've had press articles, and there's one press article that came out in April about us and about some troubling sites, especially Nazi sites that were on our network. And we painstakingly talked to the reporter about how we had to make a decision across all 7 million properties we had, and had to think carefully about what role we should be playing and the implications for starting to make decisions here and there. None of that made it into the article. And what's more important is then the next day we had about 10 different press calls of people who wanted to sort of pile on that first story and write even more about it. And I talked to all of them. It was a very exhausting day. And told them where we were coming from and how we had thought about these issues. And to a person, they essentially were like, oh, okay, I get it. I get where you're coming from. That makes sense. And I'm like, well, will you write that? We try to get that message out there. And they're like, there's no story here. I'm not going to write that. An editor would never publish that. So it's a difficult playing field to try and tell that abstract, principled story in the face of these sorts of anecdotes. So in August, when we saw the Daily Stormer issue arise in the wake of what happened in Charlottesville, and we heard increasing calls and actions by sort of other people in the arena, we felt that we were going to continue to face this dynamic, and it was going to be a difficult dynamic. And I think if you look at the blog post that our CEO, Matthew Prince, put online, it was very much trying to engage the conversation that we're now having. And that was to really tee up what this anecdote looks like. And what it looks like is, increasingly the discretion, sort of the forced discretion of tech companies under pressure to make decisions without due process, and in a lot of cases without maybe the scale or the expertise to make those decisions in the number of cases you'd expect them to make them. So Matthew made very sort of clear how disturbingly easy that was for a tech company to sort of deny its services to a website if it so chose, and therefore tried to start part of the conversation that we're continuing today to figure out what is the appropriate way to go about this. What are the ways for us to live up to our mission of helping build a better internet but at the same time make sure that we continue to be thoughtful about these sorts of issues. So I appreciate you being here today. I have a number of other thoughts about this, but again, in my role as catalyst, I'll sort of reserve those for now and try to sprinkle them in throughout our time. So thanks.
I'm Mark MacCarthy. I'm with the Software and Information Industry Association, and I wish I had a microphone that actually broadcast because my voice is very soft.
I can hear you.
But the guys in the back may have some trouble, though. But in addition to my SIIA work, I also teach over at Georgetown part-time on many of these issues. And before I was at the SIIA, I was at Visa, the payment card company, which is where I first ran into some of these questions about keeping your systems free of problematic content. Visa made the transition from not my problem to we keep our system free of bad stuff over the period of time that I was there, so I saw it firsthand. And I think the way the Visa evolved and the way the rest of the internet community evolved over the last 10 years reached a point that was pretty stable a couple of years ago. And that was, we don't actually need a lot of legal requirements in this area. Section 230 and DMCA provide a nice framework. But we all have ethical responsibilities to step up and do what we can, what's appropriate in context, to keep our system free of bad stuff, whether that bad stuff is child pornography or online gambling or hate speech or terrorist material or now fake news, the sort of issue of the day. And that seemed to be reasonably stable. Companies needed to have a set of processes and a set of standards to deal with problematic content. It wouldn't be enforced as a matter of law, but companies were expected to be socially responsible and step up to their responsibilities. In the last couple of years, I think that's changed, and I think it's reached a flashpoint where we will now see the beginnings of a regulatory net thrown over the internet companies in this area. You can see it here in the United States with movements on legislation relating to websites that are involved in child sexual exploitation. You can see it in the discussion about political discourse and the need for disclosure of the political communications, both of which are pieces of legislation that are actively being considered on Capitol Hill right now. You see it in the European Union, where just in September there was a communique that came out of the European Commission that said that the platforms were not living up to their responsibilities because their processes for taking down bad stuff were not fully automatic. They had a human being in the loop who had to stop and think about the question. And that was too slow. The stuff was out there and was being absorbed before the companies had a chance to respond. And as a result, the stuff was doing its damage. By the time the companies caught up with it, it was already available all over the internet. Problem had to be solved automatically. And what do you do about the bad stuff that is taken down maybe in error? It's not really bad stuff after all. It's really legitimate content. Well, you put that back up. And so the 10,000 people who are being employed by companies right now to screen material before the fact, well, we'll just put them to work screening material after the fact. And that way we'll be safe. That wasn't a piece of legislation. It was a very strong nudge from European commissioners suggesting that if they didn't see some improvement between now and, say, May of next year, they might have to think about a regulatory response. So we're in a new world. The new world is that voluntary measures by companies acting in accordance with their perceived sense of social responsibility is going to be perhaps replaced by legislated mandates. And the question is, what kind of a threat is that going to pose to the open and free global internet? They wanted me to be provocative, so I'm going to leave it there and see what kind of conversation we can get going in that issue.
Good morning. Hi, I'm Robert McDowell. Everyone was defined by what they are today. I was just defined by what I used to be. So I'm a recovering unelected Washington bureaucrat. I was a FCC commissioner for 7 years, appointed by 2 very different presidents, and had a wonderful time. It's the best job I'll ever have in a lot of ways. I love my job now. but complete independence. So I worked a lot on speech issues and internet freedom overall, and look forward to a robust discussion. I'll say up front, I've got to unfortunately leave for another speaking engagement about 10:30, so I'll catalyze like baking soda and vinegar, I guess, and the old science fair experiment with the volcano. And I am at Cooley. Cloudflare is a prized and coveted client of Cooley, but I'm not speaking today on behalf of anybody, which means I'll say something controversial, get into a lot of trouble, probably as we go forward. So what I thought I'd do is just quickly kind of frame some of the context, a little bit of historical context. I know everyone in the room and probably everyone watching online or listening online understands this already, but in the mid-1990s, the internet was privatized. It was the government started to relinquish its control of it, and this is both protocols and the hardware and the networks that make it work. So, all of the above, and as it migrated further away from government control, of course, private capital just started to pour into this space like we've never seen before, in terms of how quickly private capital took a lot of risks. To try to build what we have today, the internet ecosystem, which is always changing so very quickly. But it's important to understand that, yes, it started off as a government creation, but since then that government creation has been dwarfed many times over by a lot of private risk capital. So we're talking in large part about the conflict between private platforms and international laws, global laws, national laws, local laws, cultural norms, and all the rest. And that is going to create conflict for the rest of our lives in this space. But it used to be the consensus in the 90s and through the early 2000s, certainly domestically and sometimes globally or internationally, to minimize government involvement in this space. So if our hosts today are in part the Internet Society, the multi-stakeholder process for many, many aspects. You'd have loosely coupled organizations that would spring up to solve a particular problem, and then once that problem, usually a technical problem, was resolved, that group would dissolve and another group would form. Internet Society and others were formed to be umbrella organizations, but to facilitate the discussion of engineers and academics and people in the private sector and governments, all to resolve a lot of problems about primarily how the internet should work, how the engineering of it should actually operate to keep it functioning, but also growing and keep it robust. That has been changing. That idea of what is multi-stakeholderism has been changing. A lot of debate over time. Governments having a seat at the table versus governments owning the table. This is a long tug of war that will continue. And there are the operational aspects of how does it work, how do you keep the thing or things running, versus what kind of content should be running over the net. And that's and they slop over into each other's buckets at times, but the content issues are, I think, at the heart of what we're probably going to be catalyzing today with our vinegar and baking soda. Let me pivot quickly to the U.S. Our definition of free speech, I'll hesitate to use the word unique, because literally that means one of a kind, but it is unusual in our jurisprudence, back to our sort of Madisonian roots and Jeffersonian roots of that. But censorship is a legal term of art in our country that really means government interference with speech. It could be speech balancing, it could be the prohibition of speech, but that is technically what censorship means. Now, it's going to be used in a lot of different contexts to mean a lot of different things. That's fine, but I wanted to make sure we threw that out there. And if we look further at our jurisprudence of free speech on any platform, hate speech, like it or not, hate it or not, is protected speech unless it incites violence. You can go back to the 1977 Supreme Court case regarding the Nazis, just to use them as an example, marching through Skokie, Illinois, in front of Holocaust survivors. And should the town of Skokie be allowed to prohibit that? Because it was clearly hate speech and designed to taunt and do other horrible things. The Supreme Court, though, in a divided opinion, it was 5-4, said that hate speech, unless it's inciting violence, is protected speech. Part of the rationale was, what is hate speech. Political speech is core protected speech in this country, and it can be hateful, right? And from the beginning of the republic, at times has been hateful, right? We can trace many examples, but does it incite violence? And so this is a thorny issue in terms of what is hate speech, who has the authority to define what hate speech is, and that is at the core of some of these discussions. So as we look at private companies like a Cloudflare and many others, and a very thoughtful, by the way, op-ed in the Wall Street Journal a couple of months ago. At this point, seems like last week, but that was like 2 months ago, wasn't it? September?
Exactly.
Yeah, or geez.
Haven't slept much since then. So
Yeah.
one long day.
But and kudos to Brave. That was brave and bold to do that, and but very thoughtful and nuanced. And so wanted to congratulate your CEO for writing that. Or I'm sure you helped. But these are the thorny issues, and going forward, it's not going to get any easier. So for the rest of our careers, rest of our lives, when this gray hair turns white and finally fades away, we'll still be talking about these issues. So look forward to a nice, robust discussion until I have to rudely depart at 10:30. So thank you.
Great. Well, thanks to each of our catalysts for the introduction. I'll say, because we don't have microphones, as somebody who often likes to lurk in the back of these types of events, you're welcome to keep hanging back there, but we do have open seats in front, and since we're trying to do a roundtable discussion, should you want to come up, there are ample seats. So who'd like to start with weighing in here?
This is actually a public service announcement. I forgot to mention we do have a hashtag.
Oh, good.
It's hashtag #CensorStack. And if you want to get on the Wi-Fi, there's a piece of paper circulating with the Wi-Fi password.
Yes.
And I will ask a quick question. A couple of you mentioned what's going on overseas. For my money, I think what's going on overseas is even more worrisome than what's happening here. Do you have any examples you'd like to tell us about, places where you think countries are coming forward with proposals that are going to be emulated elsewhere?
Well, the chief example so far that we're still seeing sort of roll out is the German hate speech law. And I was sort of, when we were talking about Skokie before, the absence in that regulation to really define what hate speech is, but put that onto folks in the private sector sort of exacerbates that problem, right? Because they not only are judge and jury of whether or not something is hate speech, they're also sort of drafting the actual law on the fly as to what the standards are. And so that's problematic. If I had to say anything, though, about, sort of a difference in approach that I'm seeing overseas, but the U.S. has not yet taken steps on this, so I'm not sure if they'll do it any differently. But I think part of what we're talking about today and part of the issue we saw in August is really this idea of looking at the stack. I think all of us, when you watch the news or you're even hearing comments from folks like Mark today, our minds immediately go to Facebook, Twitter, and those sorts of folks. And it's not surprising, right? Because that's what the interface is for most people. And most of the practices that people are concerned about are going through those channels, right? But the way that different companies operate on the internet, who are going to get pulled into these discussions and potentially into these laws and regulations, have very different functions and do widely different things at different scale. And so I think any sort of law or regulation has to be incredibly thoughtful about those delineations. And part of what was concerning about what was going on in August is the requests for censorship went sort of up or down the stack. However, I sort of think down the stack, because you see what's on surface and there's so many things behind or beneath that. And when for the first time you had registrars and other people who otherwise do largely benign, straight, objective operational functions taking a stand on content, that was unusual. I think that there is such a concern about tech generally, especially in maybe some other jurisdictions, that we want to make sure they're breaking through and understanding exactly what it is and what parts of that they're really meant to be targeting. And so I have a little bit of a concern that all of those regulations coming from other countries are thinking very, very hard about the way the technology works and whether or not their solutions are tailored to actually get at the problem they're trying to solve.
Are there fears from overseas?
And to maybe crystallize some of that too, which is the European view generally of speech and online regulation is different from ours, and we see that in all sorts of bilateral, multilateral negotiations that we have with them, from trade to regulatory issues, and seeing as how we're using Nazis as a sort of a proxy for a lot of this discussion, obviously a lot of that has to do with World War II and the horrible things that went on there. So you can't, and never have been since the end of the war, been allowed to sell Nazi paraphernalia, memorabilia, or whatever the case might be. So that then though leads to, okay, well, what about the next version of Nazis or whatever? What about somebody else who preaches hate? And what is that? So they have, again, thornier issues. You have much more deliberation by governments, much more of a reach into technology companies than the U.S. government does in terms of content. So these aren't competitive issues. These aren't antitrust issues. This is purely the nature of the content that you may be transmitting across your facilities. And what are your responsibilities. That also then slops over easily and quickly into the law enforcement national security bucket. So you see a lot of countries internationally, not necessarily Europe, but certainly any country, justifying more regulation in this space on national security or law enforcement basis. So if you're an internet startup, in this country, you better understand what CALIA is. It doesn't matter if you're just a piece of paper and one or two people, out of your dorm room. At some point, law enforcement may come knocking because they want to know about someone who's used your service. So, again, we can all have different perspectives of what's sort of legitimate government action versus maybe less legitimate in terms of political speech and the filtering of that, and then the debate of what's hate speech versus political speech. So internationally, these are all getting slopped into one big bucket, and then there's the issue of whether or not you're going to have multilateral regulation in this area, and that's going to be an ongoing struggle.
What's the impact of this discussion relative to net neutrality in terms of just, as you mentioned, if you have a small organization that's still a startup versus a larger organization already in position to have access and being constrained to capacity or utilization of services or access?
You're looking at me.
No, it's a general question.
I got some other great minds on down the table. I just spoke way too much. I think you spoke too much.
It's a general question.
To put it very bluntly, some of the same people who want to knock off the neo-Nazis are the ones who were parading the street a year before demanding net neutrality. There's a little bit of contradiction here.
And so the term net neutrality can mean lots of things. It, over time has been a Rorschach term, as I've called it, which is it can be an empty vessel into which you pour your own definition. And so it depends on what you mean by that. But if you want to oversimplify things, sort of more government intervention in this space or less, do you want multi-stakeholderism to mean governments can be a part of it, but mainly it's non-governmental, right? So not necessarily the force and effect of law to keep things free and open, right? And that was the consensus throughout the Clinton-Gore administration, Bush administration, and until recently. They're all related in terms of you're crossing that line of how much more government intervention you're going to have, and is it going to be the regulation of private platforms versus speech versus all the rest. So as you've seen actually an interesting, since the election a year ago, an interesting dissolution of an alliance. So tech companies had enjoyed in this country a political sweet spot in that there, a lot of them from Northern California or the West Coast. They had friends on the Democratic Party. Republicans philosophically felt as if they shouldn't be regulated. Then all of a sudden, in the past 12 months, that coalition, they aren't losing one side of the aisle. They're losing support on both sides of the aisle. And you've seen calls for some of the quote internet giants to be regulated like utilities, as we've seen here, especially recently. So, as well as internet service providers and backbone providers, should they be regulated like utilities? And what does that mean? So historically, utility regulation, then I'll shut up, has been ex ante or before the fact regulation. Some can call that mother may I regulation, like I want to do X, can I? To the regulator, right? Others have also, well, when I was a commissioner, those common requests, you probably heard me say this before, some of you, I used to get, when you boil it down to its essence, is please regulate my rival, but not me. So there's that aspect of it. That can happen too when you're asking for more regulation in the space. So regulation can be a good thing, but these are, again, sticky issues which don't have easy answers.
So, John, it's not helpful to answer your question by making it more complex, but I even think there's a third axis there, right? Like if we're trying to regulate the internet based on abstract generalized principle, and on the one hand you have this neutrality mark here, and then a censorship mark, a desire for comfortable censorship here. And then the third axis I would add is the privacy discussion we're having right now, because in the same way you see a contrast with net neutrality, I also see it with privacy, which increasingly is, don't put all my stuff on the internet, leave me alone, let me sort of operate as I want in peace and privacy. But then over here, but look at everybody else's stuff and censor it to make sure that it's, safe and comfortable. There's an engagement with content that privacy discourages, that the censorship, basically requires. And so we try to figure out all that, which just goes back to the idea that we need to think very hard about what exactly is the problem and narrowly tailor solutions meant to solve that problem, right? Nazis, it's almost a priori that Nazis did not come about because of the internet. I think there's historical evidence that the Nazis were around before the dawn of the internet. So the question really becomes, what is it about tech that either causes or exacerbates that problem, but doesn't solve that problem, or isn't expected to solve that problem? And I think we're losing a bit of that. I think there's been a lot of turmoil, not only in the US, but around the world. It's been a very interesting 12 months. And I think people are distraught by some of those changes, and they want a fix. And you can either grapple with hard problems, or you can, find an easy foil. And I think there's a little bit of that going on right now with tech and some of the censorship debate. And so I would just caution folks to think about what exactly is it in the technology. Is it simply amplifying what was already out there that people were already doing or thinking? If so, then maybe we should think about whether or not it makes sense to put certain sort of limits meant only to get at the amplification in a sort of a numeric way, for lack of a better term. Or are there ways that the system itself sort of promotes and pushes, or favors in some way people who figure out the algorithm and abuse it, in which case maybe you do need to deal with, some of those aspects. But it really should be grounded in what is the technology doing that is sort of exacerbating this issue that otherwise exists in the world, and not necessarily expect that it will solve all these problems.
So the U.S. has a fairly unique law in 230, and that protects pretty much the entire stack from publishers and speaker liability, with the exception of copyright. Do other nations have a similar framework like that? Did they evolve, or is there more liability in other nations for distributed content?
Well, I'll jump in.
Yeah, go ahead.
The closest analog is the European e-commerce directive, which provides a similar kind of protection for internet intermediaries. It kicks a lot of the detailed decisions to the national governments to put it into place, and it permits a kind of legal requirement for takedown requests beyond copyright. So it's slightly different from ours, but it's moving in the same direction. It was put in place roughly around the same time, around 2000. And as I mentioned in my opening comment, there is a sense that is under pressure in Europe right now, that because of the pervasiveness of some of the terrorist activities and other difficulties, they want the intermediaries to do more. And so they're pushing at the edges of the kind of immunity from liability that the intermediaries have in Europe. They haven't done it yet. They haven't crossed the line, but they're moving in that direction.
But isn't there a real struggle between, I mean, okay, we rolled out the internet, okay, and it was basically, hey, everybody can get on the train. And everybody basically got on the train. And now everybody's doing their thing on the train. And sort of the law side stayed 20 years back while the technology jumped 20 to 30 years ahead. And now it's like this analogy bad. It's like this virus that kind of covered the earth, and now we want to try and come up with the penicillin to cure it. The point of the matter is that the legal part, I mean, sure, we create the technology, we invent all of these new apps and everything else, but the law part has to catch up to give us some point of reference that's, in some terms, a legal mind statement, the reasonable man can utilize to have some basis in making decisions about, okay, how am I going to shape my app? How am I going to shape my business? How am I going to configure it so that it has at least some chance of basic compliance with what you're asking me to do, but doesn't put me out of business, and that doesn't end up with me basically having to come in before a closed Senate or congressional hearing to answer, why did I let this information go through? Well, I'm simply in the business of trying to get, trying to service my customer. All of that stuff on the front end and the back end, that's not me. It's kind of the old story with cable companies when they first jumped into that. Everybody wanted to be considered broadband carriers, and the other people decided they didn't. And we're having the same argument over and over again. It sounds like the law part needs to catch up with the technology to at least give us technology people, who are the creators, a chance to try and meet you halfway, if you will. And I'm not saying that you're right, you guys, but just in the sense of discussion.
So I do, you distance yourself a little bit from the metaphor, but I still have to jump all over it. The internet as a virus is that's crazy, right? Like we are so focused on these narrow issues of things like fake news that it's not clear fake news is the problem or people's inability to discern fake news. Is that an educational problem or a tech problem or what sort of problem? Probably all of the above. Did fake news really cause that many people who are going to vote one way in the election to vote the other? We don't know. Fake news has been brought to light, and we still have very close elections on this very day in this country. It's not like we went from an 80-20 to a 50-50 all because of fake news. Meanwhile, today, I stop at an ATM, I pay for breakfast with a credit card, I checked in with my office, said hello to my wife and children. That was last night, not this morning. On the West Coast, I'm not cruel. But I do all of these things online that make my life incredibly better, right? And our lives are demonstrably better for that. And we don't even exist in vulnerable parts of the world where we have been able to scale up emergency response. I am also a recovering government bureaucrat as well, and one of my stops in the administration was at USAID. And you look at what USAID is able to do with a lot of core functions in the developing world because of the internet. Those are great things, right? So sometimes when I end up answering questions about people who may or may not be using, our network, I make clear we can keep doing what we're doing, which is speeding up the internet, making it more efficient so there's more access, fighting off DDoS attacks, chasing down phishing and malware attacks. So all the normal functions of everyday life can continue to go on, or we can distract ourselves from that and figure out if this is really a hate speech site or just a really worked up, alt-right person. What would you have us do to serve those larger purposes? And the more we allow people to sort of denigrate that, the internet is only there to perpetuate fake news and bots and that sort of stuff, and let everybody forget what they take for granted that's happening on the internet, we fall into a little bit of that trap of letting it be regulated in such a way that sort of goes against the philosophy you talked about of trying to give the benefits to people in a way that expanded in almost in a quite miraculous way and largely free, a great service, all of those sorts of things. I mean, Cloudflare is predominantly a free service. 90% of the people who use our service use it for free because we're about building a better internet. And we want to make sure that an individual who wants to share their cat videos with their cousin across the country is every bit as secure as a Fortune 500 company, because they're all on the same internet. And in addition to those folks having equal rights, we also want to make sure the internet stays as clean a possible place it can be for cyber attack. So sort of stop with that.
No, and excellent. If I can jump in real quick to you. I mean, maybe at the outset should have said, net, the internet is a plus. All right, I think it is.
We need those bumper stickers.
Just in case. So, overall, it is improving the human condition and not undermining it. I mean, I gave speeches on this, did some research on it when I was a commissioner, but one case study I looked at, there were some pineapple farmers in Ghana who, historically, since the beginning of pineapple farmers, had to grow their crops and then take them to a market and then find out what the price of pineapples may or may not be. In the meantime, some pineapples fall off the cart that's being pulled by the mule. They spoil in the sun. They have a risk of being robbed. They don't know who's going to be buying them or not. With the advent of the mobile internet in particular, they all of a sudden found out that they, for generations, had been charging too low a price. So they were actually able to charge a higher price. They were actually able to find buyers before they even harvested the pineapples. And this all of a sudden was revolutionary. It gave them the money to buy land and expand their land. And then they had more property, ownership of property. Their living standards increased, their expectations increased. That starts to change their political mindset as well. And all sorts of things. So, mothers can find medicine for their sick children. You can find potable water, which is actually one of still the biggest challenges in the world, through the power of the mobile internet. So we have to remember all these good things that are happening as a result.
It's actually astonishing that we have to remind ourselves about this.
I know.
But I think we do. I mean, it's very important because you get a wave of bad publicity about the bad things that happen on this communication network, and people will say, well, maybe we can get rid of all the bad stuff, and not thinking that they might, in the course of doing that, get rid of some of the good stuff as well.
So let me ask a question, because so the internet's great. We love the internet. Net positive.
Meeting over. Okay, good.
But as Cloudflare,
We're done.
I think did a nice job pointing out in their blog this summer why we terminated Daily Storm. But the internet is not a thing; it's a bunch of things. And I thought they did a really nice job. And in fact, Michael's brought little glossies, usually not glossy, but they're really nice heavy cardstock.
Frameable.
Frameable that point out essentially different layers of the internet, everything from starting with apps, platforms, content search, browsers, hosting companies, getting into the infrastructure side where companies like Cloudflare play. I'm saying Cloudflare. I got to get over that. And it, I think, helped provoke an interesting, question for me, which is, if we are going to be policing the web, in certain areas, who in the stack should be doing it? And is it more appropriate or less appropriate for different players at different levels of this stack to be playing that role? So what do folks think about that?
So let me quickly jump in on that one for the quick comment, which I don't think we want to go yet to the legal question, although we may have to. But I do think on the question of voluntary efforts and standards and protections for due process, I think everybody up and down the stack from top to bottom should be thinking about that. I don't think at any point you should say, not my problem, sorry. I just do infrastructure here. I think that could have worked some years ago, but I don't think that's going to work in the current climate. So I do think some recognition of responsibilities that go well beyond what's legally required is something that companies should be thinking about all the way up and down the stack. They'll obviously differ, from the top and the bottom, what you actually have to do or should do, or the circumstances under which you should do them. But I do think drawing a hard and fast line that says, here's the point where we regulate, and here's the point where the companies don't have any responsibility, I think that's a mistaken effort.
Go to Tim.
I want to push back on Mr. McCarthy's comment. I think your comment, Mark, presumes some sort of shared values that I'm not sure are evident. I would have assumed a year ago that here in the United States we would all have agreed that Nazi content was vile. I'm sure everybody still feels that way. I'm sure everybody would still say any activity that benefits sex trafficking would be vile. And then right after that, I think the whole conversation breaks down. What about more complicated questions? And I'm not sure that certainly the United States, relative to the rest of the world, shares the same values and would have the same thumb in the scale about the same set of questions. If you ask these questions, Saudi Arabia, Vietnam, throughout Africa, we would reach very different questions about what's appropriate content for the internet. And every single societal question, every hot button issue, I think would be adjudicated differently around the world, right? Problem number one. And then I assumed, as I said just a moment ago, that there was some sort of monolithic American understanding about these things. I don't think that's true anymore. And I think if anything, the last year has sort of laid that problem bare. And so, yes, I agree that everybody has some sort of diffuse responsibility to step forward and not say, hey, it's not my problem, I'm just gonna, close my eyes, pretend. But I don't know who gets to adjudicate those values. And I think that's the heart of the problem here. And before we get to the legal question, I think, or even the ethical question, I think we have to ask something about who's the adjudicator, and do we want those people to be adjudicating? I'm not sure that I want other people making judgments for me about what I read. I've read some strange and bizarre stuff on the internet just to make myself smarter about a question. I don't want to be prevented from ever seeing it simply because someone said that content is verboten, to use the German here, very intentional.
Thank you for going German on it. So Tim, I think you raise exactly the right issue. But let me go back to my visa experience. Word for word, what you just said was why Visa did not want to get involved in any content judgments whatsoever. Word for word. I mean, they said, the Federal Reserve Board prints money. Should they be responsible for, teenagers buying cigarettes at the local 7-Eleven? I mean, really, that was honest to God a comment that was made in these internal discussions. So you don't want to go in that direction, because once you do, you are involved inevitably in these tricky, difficult, sensitive, controversial ethical questions. So your temptation is, don't go anywhere. Draw the line at the beginning of the process and say, I'm not responsible for this stuff. It's too complicated, it's too tricky, it's too controversial. I'm not going there. And all I'm saying is that we're beyond that. We're going to have to take that step, and we're going to have to make these tricky, controversial, ethical judgments, and then take the consequences for having made those judgments and live with them. I don't think we can turn to all of the people in our societies and say to them, I know there's a lot of junk in my system, but I'm not going to make the decision there. Somebody else should do it, right? Well, if you do say that, somebody else will do it. And somebody else is probably going to be government. And they'll put in place rules and regulations that you'll have to interpret and apply. So my advice is, get ahead of this, move towards a situation where you've got standards, where you've got processes, be transparent and open about them, let yourself be criticized by people on the outside for making the wrong calls, have a mechanism for improving what you're doing, be as accountable as you can to the public and to the communities where you function. But I don't think backing away from this and saying, I don't want to go there, I don't think that's tenable anymore.
Yeah, I was just going to comment that, I'm not exactly sure how this came about, but my observation is that there is one issue that we've been censoring on the internet since the beginning, and that's child pornography. That there's been an obligation, if you're in an organization, and I know this can be discovery lawyers and other contexts, that when you're looking at someone's digital information, should you find this, you have an affirmative obligation to contact law enforcement. And I think as a norm, globally, everyone agrees that this is one area where there's international collaboration and cooperation against it, maybe as parents, as humans. The question then becomes, so what's the next issue that we can all globally agree is something that's abhorrent, that we have to collaborate with to identify the perpetrators of whatever that content is. And I don't know what that is, but I'm just throwing that out there, that there is something that I have never seen pushback against this. I've never seen anyone write that they're offended by the idea that someone has found their child pornography.
But just to do some history, that there was a time when the payment system said, "Not my problem," even about child pornography.
Really? Okay.
Right.
I haven't observed it.
And they were, there was public relations efforts that were designed to expose that and make it difficult. Does Visa want to be the payment card of choice for child pornographers? Right? It was a story in Forbes magazine in 1999. Very shortly after that, they adopted a system where they scrubbed the web 24/7, all the dark web. They hired an outside company to do it, and they found a lot of stuff. Within a year, it was down to zero. So it can be done. It has to be done. But there was a point of time where people said, I don't have to worry about that. I'm a payment system. It's somebody else's problem. It's the law enforcement problem. It's parents' problem. It's a problem of education. It's a other problem, but it's not us. And I think the systems have gotten to the point where they accept in that area that they have responsibilities. And it's gone way beyond that. All of the major systems have rules against hate speech. They all have rules against terrorist material. They all have rules about fake news. They all have rules against spam or abuse of their system for lots of evil purposes, including fraud. Those kind of responsibilities are already out there among the major intermediaries. And I think it's an area where there is some difference. Hate speech is not a unique thing where you know exactly what it is. Right? It's the kind of thing that the systems are making judgments about, and they'll get it wrong in many cases. And the only way they're going to get right or get it better at it is if there's conversation and discussion and debate about what they're doing and why they're doing it. So it can't be done in secret. It can't be done under standards and processes that no one knows about. It can't be black box attempts to understand what's going on and take steps. It's got to be reasonably public. But I do think even in areas where there's not full international agreement, companies are going to have to take some steps.
So where do you see the folks internationally getting together in what context to determine what these global norms are going to be that we're going to apply to the internet? And I would distinguish, and I think you guys have already, the services piece, the facilitation of services, which is really actually now the biggest economic driver in importance, from a communication channel that allows information to flow in a way to amplify because you don't have an intermediary deciding whether it's legitimate or not. Yesterday they were talking a little bit in the 10 years of lessons learned from Estonia about countries thinking about making themselves more secure, and the notion, because Maria Cagliarano was there, of multi-stakeholderism, because she, with this global commission that she's a part of for the governance issues, and it's interesting to see that clearly the UN process broke down and didn't go anywhere, and the question is, so what's the next step where this stuff will be decided? Because just from experience traveling around the world, one person's civil rights hero is the other person's terrorist. So, years ago you could label both Ben Gurion and Yasser Arafat as terrorists because different groups did. So are they both terrorists that should have been managed? Different time context, but it's the same thing with the controls that Russia's put in place, China's put in place, data localization, monitoring of virtual private networks. All of those things are around controlling, I think, more the information flows than the services piece, because again, I think the services piece is kind of benign. But I'm still looking to see who is getting together to decide, beyond child pornography, what the next bad thing is for all humankind.
If I can just add to that, the unique thing about child pornography, besides the fact that it's universal, everybody finds it abhorrent, it's illegal in every country, is that there are very good technical mechanisms to flag existing child pornography and to very quickly spot it if it's on your network or stored in your cloud service. That's totally different than hate speech, where somebody has to make a judgment call. I mean, this is the other difference is that distributing child pornography is itself a crime. You know, that's different than these other things that where, you know, you might be facilitating somebody else's crime. But the biggest difference, and I think Mark made it very clear, that the credit card companies have a choice and they sign somebody up. Yes, no, that's done. The other people in the stack, they have different relationships. The domain name companies are a little bit like the banks. They decide yes, no, and sometimes they don't sign somebody up because it's a trademark violation, or it's clearly a domain name that's designed for fraud. But the other companies, the ones that are moving the bits every day, if they're going to be liable for checking everything that goes across the net, so thousands or even millions of times a day, they're going to have to look at what the web page links to, and is that one particular web page a violation of some law? Is that one particular web page hate speech? That's the reason you have to look at the different layers so differently, and that's what I'm missing when I hear this debate. It's the internet has a problem, solve it.
Yeah, because when we had the first question, I think the question a few minutes ago was, you know, who should be censoring, who shouldn't? And I think, you know, you're missing an essential premise there. And again, is what is the problem that we're trying to solve? And then you look at who in the stack is this a content problem? Is it a content problem that exists or is exacerbated significantly by tech? And in what ways is it being exacerbated? And can we do something about that? And it just requires, you know, I don't think it's a call to absolve some folks and put all the burden on others. It's to be smart and be aware of these different levels, because, you know, there's obviously also a size implication here. When I was saying before that our minds immediately go to the Twitters and Facebooks of the world, and, you know, the Zuckerberg pledge to put 7,000 people on his trust and safety team to sort of cull through this, you know, that can't happen. And I haven't used this metaphor before, so I'm gonna workshop it here, and if it doesn't work, you can let me know afterward. But because maybe I'm alone on this, but I was like in 5th grade or something in a science project. We got one of these canisters that had increasingly small mesh, and you take a soil sample and you'd shake the thing up, and the pebbles would settle out, and you'd have more and more dust going down, and you'd then have all this sediment that was stratified that way. And that's part of the way that I think censorship is going to work if we just apply it monolithically across the stack, right? Because for every Facebook you have that hires 7,000 people trying to be really, really smart and still screwing it up, as we've seen as they've tried to implement some of these content restrictions, you know, that's going to be the pretty wide gauge mesh. They'll be pretty smart, but they'll let most stuff pass through, right? When you get to the smaller emerging companies on the net that don't have the resources to do that, but get really terrified because someone wrote into their trust and safety team and said, you've got hate speech on your site in Germany, and it's got to come down in 24 hours. And their response is going to be, we can't risk this, take them off, right? Then you're going to let less and less stuff through. And by the time you take that internet feed and put it all the way through the stack, you're going to have very little stuff that survives all of those tests, because they're going to be different tests, maybe substantively, and different tests that companies are able to apply as a matter of resources. And so that's part of the problem we face here if we sort of apply these restrictions in a blanket way.
And real quick, I'm going to have to run rudely, but let me kick up some sand and then run out the door. Which is well said. Overall, on the speech issues, you know, I think it's important personally to err on the side of freedom of speech, precisely because at the bottom of that filtering, there might be just nothing coming down. My other admonition would be to be wary of intergovernmental organizations who have lots of pretexts, and some of them can be legitimate up front, but it becomes the thin end of the wedge to then clamp down on political opposition and otherwise preserve authoritarian states. So be careful of the lowest common denominator of the most restrictive form of speech winning out, and this is going to be an ongoing struggle for a very long time. And you know, we are seeing a splinter net, a patchwork quilt. I used to say balkanization until I went to a multilateral negotiation. Some of the nation states from the Balkans didn't like that. So, but the splintering up of how the net's going to work. And if you look at it purely from an engineer's perspective, it's a global borderless network of networks. But unfortunately, we're now having to erect walls here and there, and let's be careful what those walls are. And having said that, I'm going to have to sneak out, but please carry on.
Thanks, Rob. One of the other things that suggests that sort of came to mind in the comment about the way that different sides might view the same person, right? You know, when one person's child of the 80s, one person's freedom fighter is another person's, terrorist, is you should really go look over the shoulder of someone who's working a trust and safety desk, right? Because when you set up systems and you set up rules that are driven to some extent by, the complaint process that comes in, you need to make sure there's an orderly way to sort of deal with those. Because if you set up these short triggers, and I know that one stuff is out there, it's causing harm, but if you set up these short triggers, no due process, and abstract, terms, there will be some well-meaning, well-intentioned, merit-based complaints that you get. The overwhelming majority of what you're going to get are the trolls and the bots who figure out what is the most acute pain point for that person sitting at that trust and safety desk. And right now it might be German hate speech law, it might be something else that is viewed as the most constrictive. And it will be amazing how much hate speech you will see coming out of a Palestinian and Israeli, conflict, or a Democratic Republican, conflict, or Pakistan, India. They'll all sort of point to the person they don't like and label it with what they know is going to be the fastest trigger for that trust and safety system. They know how to abuse those systems, and will do that better than the people who want to, in good faith, sort of utilize those systems. So it's something to be careful there as well, because we see that. I mean, people just abuse and take advantage of those systems in a way that we need to be careful about when we're crafting solutions.
So I'm interested in the responsibility piece, actually, because it seems like a lot of what we're talking about right now is responsibility on the other side as well. So if you're talking about privatization of the internet, and the only access to the internet is through private companies, is there a responsibility for allowing speech, recognizing that there's an interest in doing that? So how does that responsibility play out on both sides of the equation? How do we make sure that we maintain some ability to access the internet for lots of different kinds of speech?
So you put your finger on a conflict. Companies have responsibilities, and this is familiar in most of our daily lives. I mean, we have ethical conflicts. You keep a promise when keeping the promise is going to cause harm and damage to other people. Well, you made a promise, so should you keep it? But it's going to cause harm and damage. What do I do? These kind of ethical dilemmas are all over the place. I mean, we live with them every day. And so companies have an affirmative obligation to promote free speech. It's there. Right? They also have an affirmative obligation to take down the stuff that is causing harm to people. And they have to find a way to balance those two different, often conflicting ethical requirements. The thing I'm most worried about, to be honest, is not so much that companies will step up to make their decisions, and it's that their role in making those decisions will be replaced by a system of legal requirements, which I do think will tend to adversely affect the proper balance. People will make decisions not based upon their free and clear decision about how to set the balance, but they'll turn to the lawyers, and the lawyers will say, you have legal risk here, and legal risk means you should do this rather than that. You're safer here than you're over there, and the effect of that on the flow of free speech will be enormously restrictive. If you don't have that, if you have a little bit more open system where there's a sense of ethical responsibility, but not a brutal legal requirement, you might get a better result. And so my bottom line is don't make this a matter of legal obligations. Then you've turned it over to the legal departments, and they have a responsibility to the company to make sure that they avoid legal risk. I love lawyers, but that's their job. And we all know what that would do to the flow of free speech. So I think companies need to step up to do the right thing here, making complicated decisions in the face of ethical conflicts and dilemmas, but you don't want to turn that over to the lawyers.
But is that a stable solution? Because some companies will not abide by the ethical norms of the rest of the industry. They might actually get new customers if they promise to host anything, transmit anything, encrypt anything.
Yeah. Well, I was going to pick up on that too, but did you also, Christine?
Well, I just wanted to say that as a former in-house counsel of a global technology company that was doing business in 80 countries, every day I had to struggle to make sure that I was abiding by all the requirements of each country, because very often they conflicted. And you figured out what you had to do, and it's no different in these contexts. And and as someone who is of German heritage, and having spent time there and understanding the culture and the history of what's gone on, I understand why the requirements are in place to prohibit Nazi paraphernalia, to really focus on making sure what happened before never happens again. The strategy's been in place for some decades. Maybe it could have some tweaking and updating, but there's a sincere, I think, belief in that country that they're doing the right thing for humanity. And it makes it difficult for corporations to figure out how to implement that. And certainly American corporations, because they don't necessarily live in the culture and have the context. But it's not so different from other requirements, for example, in France, where you can't disclose who your clients are. And there's, again, all these different requirements, country by country basis. And we figure out a way to try and comply. It gets complicated when countries like China and other places have these requirements that absolutely go against our values, and that's been the criticism for some time now around working in those places where you're asked to, based on existing law there, to do something that's against the norm of the industry. And I don't know that we've figured it all out, but the point is that it's hard and it's complex, and we have to work on it, because to the extent that, at least from the perspective of trying to prevent another Holocaust, you want to make sure that you're monitoring the activity in country, and that, I think, is what the Germans are doing. And if anyone has a different opinion, I'd love to hear it, but I think it's a sincere desire to prevent. It makes your life complicated, though.
I'm picking up on this line of conversation. I mean, the thing I was going to say, I've been sort of saying repeatedly, we need to think about the problem we're trying to solve, which we seem to have lost our way on in crafting solution. And then I think the second question is this a problem that might solve itself? Are there incentives in place and dynamic structures in place that might lead us toward a solution short of sort of heavy-handed, sort of set of regulations that can be difficult to implement? Because, look, if Twitter and Facebook, even without congressional hearings last week, was facing a lot of backlash on this and taking significant steps to try and get this back in control. Mark's talking about sort of the ethical obligations on a place like Visa, but he's also talking about an article in Forbes or whatever it was that certainly drove them to sort of change what they were doing, short of government regulation in this space. So I think there needs to be a little bit of that question of, are there efficient mechanisms that are already in place to let these companies do that? And that's part of the way we at Cloudflare think about this issue as well. We weren't comfortable taking the step we took with the Daily Stormer and then trying to sneak back into the shadows. I mean, we did the exact opposite of that. We wanted to explain to people, we have these principles, we have these values, and we want to talk about that because we want to have this conversation and make you aware of why we're doing what we're doing from that side as well. And I think there are those systems in place to sort of test you and push you on that. I always like the example of going back and talking about spam, which was about to kill email there for a while, right? And there were a lot of concerns about that. But the companies had their own incentives, realized people were going to stop using their system unless they came up with a solution for it, and did it pretty effectively without government regulation or things like that. And I do think to some extent there is reason to think, although that there is a lot of motivation to let those types of companies figure out the bot and fake news problem, because they have a reputational problem that motivates them on this space. So we also need to make sure that is allowed to be a part of the conversation. What is the dynamic that would push solutions in the direction already absent sort of changes in law or regulation?
So So in the stack, which is the conversation we're having, we're talking about in totality relative to the net, we're talking about the side of the net that's visible to the public versus the side that's the dark side, or we're talking the totality of responsibility. Because a lot of stuff moves from one place to the other, and, you know, a certain percentage of the public never sees it. It never hits. So, I mean, there's stuff out there we definitely would not want to have the public decide on. So in terms of that stat, I hear what you're saying about sort of the marketplace will kind of handle this if allowed to do that. The question becomes, where's the delta? Where's that point where it's like, okay, you know, I mean, if the regulators stay back and just let the market deal with it, at what point does the public rise up in whatever product? Because we know as we go from country to country, as you were saying, okay, it shifts. You have landing rights for that particular country. You have to adapt if you want to do business in that country. But at some point in time, okay, where's that point? Where's that pressure point? Where's that pressure point that causes the company? Okay, we're going to do business in Germany. We have to adjust all of our servers, distribution in Germany to accommodate what they're saying. We're going to do business in the U.S. Freedom of speech is the norm of the day. Okay, I kind of like the open free market thing. Okay, and as you said, you want to do business, you adjust. But well, it becomes a challenge. It becomes a dynamic. Can we do it? I think we've got more than enough technology. I think we've got more than enough skill, capability, and people to make it happen. When does it start? When do we really get into the thick of making it happen? There's going to be a gap in there where it's just going to be, there's going to be exposure. And whatever's hot is what's going to get the most attention first.
That's actually a question I had. So, you know, getting back to, you know, some of the things we talked about at the beginning, now that this, you know, precedent's been set, where does it stop? So, you know, Christina's pointed out, I think we can all agree globally, Nazis, pretty bad, terrorism, pretty bad, child pornography. But then you were asking, well, what else goes into that bucket? And are we at a point where we just say globally, okay, these three things are in the bucket, and this is where, you know, companies can actually take action? Or now that we've taken action against some things that everybody disagrees against, does that now open the door for other parties to say, well, this thing's pretty damn offensive too, or this thing's pretty dangerous as well, and so we should, you know, also take action? You know, I was looking at the Daily Stormer blog post that Cloudflare put out, and it said, well, our terms of service reserve the right for us to terminate users of our network at our sole discretion. And, you know, I'm thinking, I'm just going to be a little salty and throw a little, you know, fire out there. The case a couple of years ago, or I guess it was last year, of the baker in Colorado who got sued because he refused to bake a wedding cake for a gay couple. So, you know, my discretion, I, you know, find this offensive, I'm not going to bake this cake. So, you know, are we now opening the door once companies weigh in and say, well, we're going to do it for this, for either other companies who have an ideology or other governments around the world who have an ideology on an issue like that, to start putting pressure on the companies to take action?
But every terms of service, you either agree to the terms of service or you don't. And if the terms of service say we can change and do whatever we want, you either, I'm just saying.
That's why we have lawyers.
Well, and that's why we were transparent when we took something that we think deviated from what had been our very public position on this, so that people knew what they were getting when they signed up with the terms of service. And I'll push back a little bit about, you know, your bucket. I think the point was made before that, you know, child sexual abuse material is you know, fundamentally different, but I think you also put what, speech and what else did you put? And terrorist organization in the bucket. And again, like, once there's not clear agreement on where the circles are around those subjects, and once you put those in the bucket, then, you know, people who are against LGBT rights in different parts of the world are going to, you know, refer to those folks as terrorists against our values, or, you know, that you know, hate speech is, you know, you can imagine people on either side of the abortion debate characterizing what the other side is doing as you know, hate speech or something like that. So, you know, it's that agreement, those sorts of things can be very, very difficult to sort of easily figure out when it comes to content.
I mean, one of the things to remember is that the companies involved all the way up and down the stack are private companies. And for the most part, they can choose to do business with whomever they want. And so we may not like it, but a hosting site could say, I don't want to host Black Lives Matter. I mean, they could say that, and we would then have to live with the fact that that's not the kind of group that they want to do business with. They might have a hard time explaining that to the rest of the world and justifying it, but it's certainly not a legal problem if they make that kind of judgment. But on the other hand, there are legal requirements that companies could cross. For example, if they were to say, I just don't want any African Americans using my service at all. I mean, the fact that you're using an internet service doesn't mean that you're exempt from the discrimination laws, right? You can't sort of say, I'm using the internet, the laws don't apply to me, right? But I do think on the censorship angle, we have to distinguish between, what government, probably wouldn't be allowed to do because it would be too much of an infringement on free speech, and what private companies can do, which may be more restrictive than what we would like under the First Amendment.
Most people don't understand that free speech is related to the government, not to private companies. They don't have even that basic understanding of the Constitution.
So a quick point on this as well. When it comes to doing business with whom you want to do business, as long as it's not discriminatory or something else, that will be the first. To some extent, I think that will be one of the first casualties of increased censorship. Is companies make it much more restrictive about who they're doing business with, and the availability of free services extensively on the internet might dry up pretty quickly, so that you can make sure you're dealing with a user pool that may not create this sort of liability for you or have this sort of content. And one of the things we talk about at Cloudflare from time to time, because as I said, we're largely a free service trying to make sure the internet is the best it can be, is you could very easily see a world where there is a sort of acceptable internet and a sort of back alley internet for people who can't afford to put their websites on sort of the good internet, for lack of a better term. I mean, you see this already. Google, I think about 6 months ago or something, started if you were going to unencrypted sites, if you weren't going to an HTTPS site, they gave you an interstitial that sort of said, this is not, this is a little sketchy. You might want to click through here. And I haven't seen any reports on whether that led to people not going to those sites, but you can see that happening more and more. Now, Cloudflare is one that, as a free service, rolled out sort of encryption and other sort of tools that allowed everybody to meet those standards. But if companies like ours, stop doing that, you really may end up with an internet that people can afford to pay for, and one that people can't, and the people who can't to buy those sorts of tools or cross those sorts of barriers might not have the same sort of access to the internet that they do today, which is not a development we would want, but could be one of the implications coming out of where we're going.
So I have a U.S. legal question, and I think this is having good norms and due process and this sort of thing is commendable. Yeah, I wonder, and it sounds like in the past, none of these are pure conduits. There's been child pornography and spam and fraud and other things filtered. But at what point do you run into copyright problems? My understanding is 512 of DMCA, if you remain a passive transmitter and the quote is automatic technical processes to transmit, you gain protection against copyright lawsuits. So if companies are, and the entire stack is doing more picking and choosing, at what point do you run into copyright problems? Or, does there need to be a change in the law, or is there, a way out of that copyright issue?
So I'm not sure I get your question exactly, but let me explain a little bit about how we think about 512, and if you've got a follow-up, I'm happy to answer it. So, we view the operation of our network as a 512A automated process to transmit information that really doesn't do anything with the content, other than transmit it. There's also a 512B issue that from time to time some information will get cached in our system. So if people come to us, as 512B requires, and sort of says, hey, we have this, we went through due process, we have this order that says this should be off the internet and it's still sitting in your cache, can you go clear that? We do that. We don't get those all the time because stuff doesn't sit in our cache for very long. But also can do those. And there are other provisions as well that talk about not interfering with sort of standard processes. And so one of the things we do with our trust and safety process is we know by the way that people try to determine where the website host is, where that information actually lives, and the 512c obligation would sit, the notice and takedown obligation, that because we prevent cyber attackers from getting information about that host, there are also parts of the whois search that will report to us. So our system is set up in an automated way to provide information about that host so that people can contact the host who would have that 512c obligation and follow through on the DMCA processes to deal with that. So that I think goes out of everything I've sort of been talking about. We look at what the impact of our network is, and we try to take reasonable steps to deal with problems that the operation of our system may cause, but not to undertake the obligation to solve problems that really have nothing to do with our network and how we operate. That's a bit of our philosophy.
So you don't see more copyright liability exposure
As a result
if
of,
you're picking and choosing more content to pull down.
You're saying, do we see more if we have an obligation to?
Yeah, more of a curator.
Yeah,
Transmitter.
Then I think, as long as 512, as long as the safe harbor is still there and part of the law, then I think we'd still have that immunity. But I think what you're saying is the more you have to start look at content in these different ways, does it sort of lead into, does the organization of 512A start to collapse a little bit because you're already reviewing the content, and so why don't we throw these other obligations on you as well, sort of thing? And that's, I think, a bit of the slippery slope we've been talking about is once you start to go down that road, you could hang all sorts of ornaments on that Christmas tree once you have everybody in the stack sort of reviewing and passing judgment on content. But I think we've talked a little bit about, how dangerous that gets as a censorship thing from one point of view, and secondly, we would. We're 500 employees right now, right? We would become 8,000 employees, 7,500 trust and safety officials, and a couple hundred engineers. And it would take us from the task and what we really do well, which is making sure that we keep the internet as cyber secure as possible. We keep it running smoothly. We do that job as best we can and deal with everything else. But I certainly have that concern that if we start to make these extensions and then we're passing judgment on fake news, boy, it's really, really close to starting to do some other troubling things once you start getting involved like that. Yes.
I think I came I was not involved with the internet, and somehow I got involved in around 2001. And one of the things I've seen, I've been with the DC chapter, I've been with the IGF, is this struggle. Basically, it's almost a worldwide struggle of the international institutions. Some I feel are trustworthy. Some when you get into them, you cannot trust what's going to come out. So I do see this constant struggle about, the non-governmental society, sometimes in alliance with, sometimes not in alliance with business, commerce, and how do we keep things open in the face of these precise things in a society in which I think the fear-mongering has really taken over what your first statement was, the overall benefits. And any thoughts on how to handle this basic, I would say, worldwide struggle that's going on?
How to make the internet good again.
Well, yeah, we certainly talked about that before, like making sure we're talking about the abstract principle, right? It's hard to talk about it, but continuing to talk about all the different ways that the internet is good, and also to talk about the value and importance of innovation on the internet. As we said, it's essentially a miracle the way that the internet as a free service spread around the world and provided that opportunity to folks. But it also has not been a sort of static group, right? Like we're not all still dealing with AOL or whatever. We moved into other things, and are Google, Facebook, Apple, Twitter, and Amazon the end state, right? Is that where we're going? Are we pulling up the ladders behind them? Because this goes back to one of the questions asked earlier about country by country compliance. Is all of those companies essentially were able to scale at a time that there was sort of one set of standards. They wouldn't have had the resources to sort of mount that march country by country, border by border. in, I think, a little bit ahead of that door as well. We've been able to scale up and now have to deal with these things. But as a new entrant 5 years ago, 6, 7 years ago, we wouldn't have been able to scale the way that we scaled. And there is a little bit of that impact of, are we ready to pull up the ladders and sort of live with these pillars of the internet for the next 20, 30 years? Because I find it difficult to think, in the absence of that, you could certainly see something coming along and displacing Facebook, right? The kids all the time are doing new things. One of the first times I've used that phrase. Like, you'll all be getting off my lawn in about 7 minutes. But it's leaving the door. That's part of the magic of the internet and where the internet may go in another 10 or 20 years. Is the kid in high school right now who's the next Zuckerberg figuring something out and doing that. The way we're going with all of this makes that much, much harder to do because of the nature of the internet and the way that innovation happens on the internet.
Can I just point out that when the Arab Spring happened, it was pretty much known in this area that the CIA was caught flat-footed. I mean, they didn't appreciate and understand the power of Twitter. Twitter didn't cause the Arab Spring.
Right.
Twitter just facilitated communications and made it easier for people to organize, etc. The fact that we fell victim to an influence operation that has been going on for years and we weren't, can't blame, getting back to your point, can't blame the technology for people not thinking through how it's going to be leveraged for someone to achieve the political aim that they have. So
and we can and listen. I was in the Obama administration for 7 years, so I'd love to sort of go along with the idea that we fell victim to a foreign intelligence operation. But have we seen proof of that yet again? Like, I go back, like, how much did all of us just sort of wake up to the idea that white nationalism was much more prevalent in the United States than I realized in my comfortable little space a year ago, or that there are a lot of people that it wasn't just sort of the income inequality that Bernie was talking about, but a real resentment among maybe 50% of folks. So, like, again, I know you sort of said it in passing as part of a larger point, but I want to challenge all of those presumptions that, are these problems in the world that we should be working on a much larger level, or are these actual problems that caused actual harms that are, if not solely, largely dependent upon the tech that happened? I mean, this needs to be a bit of a larger conversation. We need to make sure that we're having that. Because there's a little bit of the transparency here, right? Like, did all of this just sort of expose, and this comes up every once in a while with the Daily Stormer piece, did all of this just sort of expose things that were already part of our society that we weren't paying enough attention to? And by pushing Daily Stormer, denying them our services, maybe pushing them off Google, they're going to find some place to go and still live in dark places and sort of germinate there. And is that the best way to do it? Or is it, is Justice Brandeis's, sunlight is the best disinfectant, us being aware of what these folks are doing, being able to talk about it and show displeasure and push back on that rather than just sort of letting it happen? Because even 6 months later, you had a bunch of people in torches show up in Charlottesville. We were all like, holy cow, like, where's this coming from? And is it better to push all of that into isolation, where it will probably continue to be, or to make sure that there is, that if people are doing this and thinking this and communicating in this way consensually, that, that is it really, is it really more of a benefit to sort of push that into the dark places?
So let me jump in on that, because, I think you were racing especially, but I think you by implication, that this whole push towards regulating fake news and largely the larger question of how people get their news in a world that's dominated by Facebook, Twitter, Google, and the thousands of other platforms that are out there that spread news in ways that are very, very different from the way people used to get their news with broadcast and television, radio, and newspapers and magazines. I think we're way ahead of the issue at this point. I mean, people are still saying, the election, that was the result of fake news or the Russian operatives, and everything was different because we had social media, and the social media were hijacked by these bad people. And I think your point is that that's not what happened. I mean, most of the people who voted in the election got their news from local television. And they were influenced in their beliefs and their values and their judgments by local television. And the idea that somehow the Russians or other operators were able to significantly influence the election by influencing what people saw on Facebook is just factually wrong, okay? Now, that's a debate, I think, that's beyond us, though. I think people are going to need to recognize that regardless of what the truth is about what happened in the previous election or in other elections around the world, the fact that people got their news from local news this time, and probably next time, and the next time after that, and the next time out of that, doesn't mean that that's the way people will always get their news. Sooner or later, most people will get their news in exactly the way people are saying they got their news today, namely through some variety of internet platform. And we don't know how to regulate that mechanism yet. We know how to regulate radio and television. We know how to regulate newspapers. We don't know what to do about a news distribution mechanism that is not the old-fashioned broadcast newspaper mechanism. And we're just beginning to throw a regulatory net about that, around that. And we can get it immensely wrong if we're not careful. So I do think this is the time to think about it. I don't think we're going to get very far in disputing the factual stuff about the last election, because we have to put in place something that's going to be not for this coming election or the next one, but for the way people will be getting their news and participating in the democratic process in the next generation. I wish it weren't starting right now in exactly the way it is, but it is, and I do think we have to engage.
I mean, my sense is a lot of this, though, right now, in the current moment where we may be regulating, is being put on the head of tech, and these platforms. And I think, cautioning what we were talking about before, again, I'm not saying in an absolute way that I think the market will heal itself or that tech didn't have anything to do with this. I mean, certainly there are, these are all sort of within shades of gray, but to put down rules and laws and regulations that will persist for a very long time and create the boundaries here is a significant move, and something that should be taken, very carefully after we've sort of measured, all the way that fits together. And I just also have to say, one of the things the cautionary tales we can provide about this is, shortly after the election last year, if people had said we need to get about regulating this fake news, I think everybody would have just, overwhelmingly sort of supported that. But when you look 8-9 months later, the people who have really claimed the mantle of defining what fake news is are not the same people we thought would have been the arbiter of that. We have certain officials who are crying fake news all the time for mainstream sort of news organizations, but that's the exact sort of thing. Once you start to mess with this content and allow those sorts of decisions as to what is fake news and what isn't, whether it's a senior government employee, whether it is a CEO of a tech company or someone sitting at a trust and safety monitor, like, these are very difficult things to do, and they don't always turn out the way you may think they turn out when you make the virtuous choice to go after a wrong.
So on that note, we're a few minutes past our wrap-up time. Any final comments or questions from anybody?
I've said enough. I think
no,
I don't.
That was a good ending.
Yeah.
Just when I first got on the internet, I read a thing by Nicholas Negroponte, and he said people think about it as this network, but really it's a net, like a fishing net. You're swimming in the bit stream, and then you use the net to catch the bits as they go past. And I think that we're all finding this out now.
Yeah, I think that's right. And listen, just even that sort of understanding of exactly what the internet is and how it works and all the different roles in it is as much as anything we think needs to be brought to this conversation.
If I could just say thank you to Jolie McPhee for being such a great webmaster and for putting more bits out there on the net. I hope many people will watch this in the coming weeks.
Great. Well, look, thanks to all of you for coming out on what's now become a rainy day.
Yeah.
Beautiful when it came down. On behalf of ISOC and Venable, thanks for coming today. Hope
Thanks
to
for
do this
hosting
again.
us. This is not. It's going to be a longer term thing, hopefully.